I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 47 of EO Radio Show. This is the fourth in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In episode 38, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Episode 40 focused on the state filings in Nevada and Arizona, and in episode 43, we looked at Washington State and Oregon. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we will talk about the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Alaska and Hawaii. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes.
Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here.
As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entity. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be registered and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the law, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we focus on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available in the state, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Alaska or Hawaii, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. So for the details on Alaska and Hawaii, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. He has also worked for Morrison & Foerster in their intellectual property litigation group. So, welcome to the show, Joe. It's glad to have you here again.
It's good to be back again.
So let's start with Alaska. For an organization that's forming in Alaska, what's the document that they start with?
In Alaska, it's not their Secretary of State. It's the Division of Corporations, Business, and Professional Licensing that governs entity formations. They do have a form Articles of Incorporation for domestic entities. Their fill-in form is pretty robust with a section for specific purposes of the corporation and an additional articles attachment proviso for specific provisions that you would like to have added that are germane specific to your nonprofit. As always, as we'd like to discuss, there are some quirks. This form asks for the NAICS code, and that, pronounced NAICS colloquially, is the North American Industry Classification System. And it is the standard used by all federal statistical agencies in classifying entity establishments for the purpose of collecting, analyzing, and publishing statistical data related to the U.S. business economy. This comes up with the U.S. Census, for example. We've had a couple this year where we've had nonprofits asked to fill those out. On the top level, it will be a 6-digit number, the first two of which will be what the government calls the sector, i.e. if it's agriculture or construction or education, followed by 4 more digits specifying more particulars within that sector. Generally, nonprofits will fall under Sector 8.1, which is other. It's just more their generic catch-all rather than specifics. And then, for example, a grant-making nonprofit, it would then further be 8.132, the 3.2 defining as grant making, and then further differentiation to, for example, 813.211 for grant making foundations versus, say, 813.212, which would be for voluntary health organizations. Well, this can seem very granular and kind of scary to think about. This is all done with when we start talking about your IRS 1023 about what your specific needs are. So it's not nearly as scary as it could sound to a nonprofit.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring up. So it's interesting that Alaska is our first state that we've come across that organizes data using this classification system. But I guess I want to point out that there's no legal recourse or issue if you put the wrong number in there. It's just for data gathering. So no need to stress out or get too worried about choosing the right NAICS code. Also, by the way, you can find those codes pretty easily just by Googling NAICS. And we'll put a link in the show notes to the easiest resource to access. So anyway, it's interesting to me that this is coming up in Alaska of all places. Other quirks and features of the Alaska filing?
Yeah, so we've talked about this before, but here all original directors must be named, and there is a minimum of 3 here in Alaska. More interesting, the form must be signed by at least 3 incorporators as well. All the states we've looked to at this point have only required a single signature. So be aware of this, especially in terms of timing, to make sure you are able to get all these signatures when you want to form the company. Domestic entity will also need to file an initial report online. The state recommends that this be done as soon as possible after the formation. So we've talked about this with some of the other states like Nevada, where we wanted to do those at the same time. Here, the state specifically says you should be doing this with your filing. If we're talking about our foreign nonprofits, the form that they have is a foreign certificate of authority. It's similar to the articles, but there are a few differences. It does still call for the purpose and the NAICS to be included. Besides the directors, the president, the secretary, the treasurer, and any vice presidents need to be named. And this form will need 2 signatories, the president or the vice president, and the secretary or an assistant secretary. So you have 2 either ors marked by an and there for your signature. So again, think about your timing of getting these people to be able to be around to sign off when you're forming or when you're registering.
Yeah, so that's a lot of names to put in your initial filing. In some of the states, like Delaware, I think you only need 1 person's name. In California, you just need the incorporator. Yeah, so Alaska is taking a lot of identifying, and you may have the same 3 people that serve as directors may hold all these offices. So maybe it's not that many people. But anyway, that's an interesting little quirk for Alaska. So how expensive is it in Alaska? Is this one that's going to break the bank to file as a nonprofit or to register as a foreign? And by the way, by foreign, we mean not organized in Alaska. So it's a domestic U.S. charity that we're talking about. What's the filing fee look like?
For both the domestic articles and for those foreign certificate of authority, the filing fee will be $50. As always, when we talk about this, especially if you don't have a huge presence in Alaska, remember that any service fees associated with an agent you have chosen to be your service person there. We've talked about this before, using a professional service like CSC or RASI or someone like that.
Yeah, and there's additional costs that come with that. How quick is Alaska? What's their processing time look like?
Here in July, Alaska notes their standard processing time for mail submissions is 10 to 15 business days, and online gets immediate processing time. Both are reviewed in the order they received. Unlike many of the other states we've looked at, though, they do not have an expedite option available at current. So you put yourself in the queue and you see what happens. Again, I haven't filed one lately, taking it at face value that they have a fairly rapid return on their online formations.
Or online registration of the foreign.
Or online registration, yes.
You can do both of those online. One other thing we'd like to check off here is the privacy transparency issues. I think we already talked about that enough that we need the 3 board members and all the officers on the foreign certificate.
That's all they've really got. There's not anything deeper than that we're looking at here.
So let's talk a little bit about the annual filings. Once we've registered in Alaska, how often do we have to update with the state?
Okay, so this is going to be really quirky here, much more so than even the NAICS here. So Alaska has a biannual fee based on the year the entity was formed, which isn't, on the top level, isn't much different than what we talked about with California. Nonprofits created in an even-numbered year, the biannual report date will be due July 2nd of every even numbered year.
Oh, my goodness.
And if the entity is created in an odd numbered year, the biannual report will be due July 2nd of every odd numbered year. So, for instance, we formed this year, 2023 in Alaska, our first report will be due July 2nd, 2025. So whether we formed a few months ago, or we formed today, or we form in December, it's the same. It's that July 2nd. As we've talked about with the articles and the registration, these reports can be filed online, but if they're mail filed, any biannual reports postmarked after August 1st incur a late penalty fee. Similarly, any done online post July 2nd will incur this penalty. So they give you a little more time for the mailing, but if you've posted them online, it's a little odd.
That is quirky. We haven't seen this one before, but so if you form January 1st of an odd numbered year, your next reports are due 2.5 years later. And well, you'll have one due that year.
Right. You'll have that initial when you first form, irrespective. So like if we form today, July 12th, you have essentially filed your initial report July 12th, July 13th as well. But then your next one won't be due till July 2nd. But if we form in November, yes, we do file November 1st. We do an initial report then, and then not till July 2nd of 2025 will your next report be due.
Okay, well, I guess that's what calendaring systems are invented for.
And when we get to Hawaii, we'll get even more densely into this. So,
all right. So, what do the fees look like? Is it the biannual fee
for both the domestic and a foreign nonprofit? It's $25 to file the biannual fee. So, relatively small. That's the same as what we have when we talked about California as well.
And we may need to put this in the show notes, but if that late fee might rack it up quite a bit, but $25 seems quite manageable. Hopefully the late fee is not too much, because I can certainly imagine this one slipping through the cracks. Any other state agencies in Alaska that our nonprofits need to be aware of?
Much as we discussed with Washington last month, a business license will need to be obtained if the nonprofit meets the state's criteria of having like an office and certain requirements like that. Additionally, an Alaska nonprofit that solicits funds will need to register with the Department of Law. And that annual deadline, then with that, you'll need to renew annually. And their registration is September 1st every year, again, irrespective when you do that. For our California-based nonprofits, this is essentially the same function as the Office of the Attorney General takes for registering nonprofits. So it's very similar to that. And then finally, if the nonprofit will be using games to generate donations like bingos, raffles, lotteries. And then we talk about some Alaska specifics, like specifically they call out Ice Classic. So if you're doing that, and pull tabs, which I actually looked up, pull tabs are a type of like lottery card specific, like a scratch off card. Then you need to obtain a gaming permit from the tax division of the Department of Revenue. So they have essentially, in theory, if you're doing a lot of on-site stuff, you could be registering with 3 additional agencies beyond just their Secretary of State equivalent there in Alaska. So be aware of that. They have a lot of steps in place. Okay,
so a quirky state for our nonprofits. So moving on to, I was going to say everyone's favorite state, but that's probably not true, but a very popular vacation destination. Let's talk about Hawaii. What's needed to file as a nonprofit corporation in Hawaii and our foreign nonprofits that want to go there and solicit or do business? What do we need?
So here too, the state has a form articles of incorporation for domestic nonprofit formations. Similar to California, which we've talked about before, this is not a very robust form. It has name, address, agent, name of the incorporators, a checkbox for whether the nonprofit has members or not, and some generic Hawaii law nonprofit language. Like California, it may make sense to look into drafting an actual document that meets the requirements needed for you to get all your nonprofit information in rather than try to use the form. Then for a foreign nonprofit, it's an application for certificate of authority for foreign corporations. This Hawaii form is actually used for both profit and nonprofit foreign registrations, and it has an actual checkbox at the beginning to confirm whether it's a nonprofit or profit usage. So that's kind of unusual. With that in mind, the form itself has no nonprofit specific language elsewhere. We've talked about this before. When you do register, obviously, you're wherever your primary state is going to be that primary. So if you are in Delaware, we've talked about this, our Delaware nonprofit articles are pretty robust, or when we do the California ones, they're pretty robust. So when you're registering as a foreign, it's really just a checkbox to say, yes, I'm registered here. yes, this is who I am. This is what, and that is the operative document. It just gives you the authority to do in that state. So it doesn't necessarily need to have all of those items because it's just a, yes, I exist and yes, I can do this. And we've talked about it, I think, a little bit. It's good to remind you too that when you do as a foreign register, you will need a good standing certificate from whatever state you were formed. That's pretty much universal across every state to prove that you already have this entity and that it meets the criteria of that state as a nonprofit. So that's just something to keep in mind as you do the foreign registrations as well.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Let's talk a little bit about cost and timing for filing in Hawaii. Does it take a while?
We'll talk about the filing first. The filing fees for both a domestic and a foreign registration are simply $25. They, oddly enough, do have an additional $1 fee imposed by the state archives for permanent records that will be collected by the Business Registration Division on behalf of the State Department of Accounting and General Services. So they have this additional service fee where they keep things archived there on the islands. Just an odd little quirk. And then, as always, we just talked about it with our Alaska. Remember that you're going to have agent service fees attached to this as well. As for timing, on the Hawaii website for July, normal filings are filed within 3 to 5 business days, and an expedite is available for an additional $25, with the expected filing then within 1 business day. The state website very proudly says it touts an efficiency similar to that of Delaware for filing immediately and efficiently. So I don't know if I would even necessarily need the expedite then, but again, that's very, very cheap. A $25 expedite we've talked about, like with California, where it's hundreds of dollars to do. That's even double what we talk about in Delaware, where it's usually $50. So it may be worth it just to think about. So even with an expedite, you're only paying $50 to actually register your nonprofit, which is actually pretty good.
Let's talk a little bit about transparency in Hawaii. How many names do we have to give them?
Actually, in the domestic articles, there's nothing needed whatsoever in terms of like officers. It's similar then to Delaware, where you just have an incorporator sign off on it, and that's it.
Just check the box.
And then with the foreign application, it does require all officers and all directors to be named. And again, because we've already formed, that should be something that's already in place that you've got. But if there are privacy, transparency issues of board members, for instance, you need to think about that.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, though, with the nonprofit corporations, all of the names will eventually be listed on the Form 990 for the year. But sometimes when you're getting started, you may not want or know exactly who the directors are going to be. So it can be a little bit of an issue starting out when you have to name the directors and the officers for a new entity. So let's talk about annual filings. You had a teaser a little bit ago that Hawaii is quite quirky in this regard. So break it down for us.
It makes Alaska look simple, and we're back to this is sometimes we say we're legal so we don't have to do math, but this is definitely a math question here. So with Hawaii, the breakdown is if the date of registration or the date of formation falls between January 1st and March 31st, then your annual report is due by March 31st of that year, of every year.
Okay, so it's annual.
It is annual, yes. If your formation or registration falls between April 1st and June 30th, then your annual report is due by June 30th. If you formed between July 1st and September 30th, then your annual report is due by September 30th. And if you formed in October, from October 1st to December 31st, then your annual report is due by December 31st of each year. Essentially, it's by quarter.
Mm-hmm. So for the foreign registration, this is based on when the registration is sent, not when the foreign organization was incorporated.
Not when it was incorporated, but when you register in Hawaii.
Gotcha.
It's based on all of this is based on what they consider start your business in Hawaii, whether it be forming it or whether you register it. They also, include the proviso that if an entity is registered in the same year in which the annual report or statement is due, the registered entity shall not be required to file an annual report or statement for that year. So, which can be rather intimidating when you try to parse this out. So if we register our nonprofit this week, July 12th, July 13th, then our first annual report will be due by September 30th, 2024.
Oh my gosh. How am I going to remember that?
Yeah. And that, like I said, this is a good reminder that you should put into place an active calendar tracking for your entities. We talked about a little bit with Alaska where it's the July 2nd, which is kind of an odd day to have it. We've talked about it with Delaware where everything is March 1st. But here you've really got to go back to where you started. On our end, as for our clients, for our nonprofits as a courtesy, we do track and remind about a month in advance on all of these filings, but it's always a good reminder to have something internally tracking these as well, especially something like this.
All right. So wrapping up, let's talk a little bit about the annual fees that go with this quirky due date and any other state agencies that our nonprofit needs to be aware of in Hawaii.
Depending on whether you file online or via mail, the fee for the annual report is $2.50 online and $5 via mail in Hawaii. And this can be expedited for the $25 as well. And here they were very specific. If these are filed late, you incur a $10 per year late fee penalty. But again, it's $2.50 to do it online. It really is, like I said, that's kind of beyond reasonable. It's kind of odd. Obviously, the state of Hawaii is making their money from tourism and not from their state fees, unlike, say, Delaware, where that's where they make the money. The real money is not in state fees in Hawaii.
I guess that makes some sense. So the other agencies in Hawaii?
So if the nonprofit is a charity that solicits for donations, then they must also separately register with the Hawaii Attorney General Tax and Charities Division. Again, this is like the California, the same thing. It's the Attorney General's office, or like we talked with Alaska with their Department of Law, the same idea that you will register annually for them.
Well, I think this also kind of goes to, as we wrap up this episode, now that we've gotten through 8 states, it's becoming ever more obvious that charities that have to register in multiple states have a lot of a compliance burden, and the actual fees due in each state. Some of the states like Delaware are significant. Some of them like Hawaii the actual state fees are not that much, but it's the tracking and the compliance burden in-house or with outside counsel that starts to really add up for these multi-state registrations. So thanks for joining me today, Joe. As usual, this has been an interesting exercise in looking at the quirkiness of these different states. We'll continue with a couple more states in a month or so. So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources in Alaska and Hawaii, and go back to episodes 38, 40, and 43 if you want to learn more about the California, Delaware, Nevada, Arizona, Washington, and Oregon state filings. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.